And I think also the role that is rarely acknowledged of the press by people of color of being anti-war and anti-imperialist. And one of my favorites is Frederick Douglass, who not only was the editor of several African-American newspapers throughout his lifetime, but who was also one of the most vocal opponents of the U.S. war against Mexico, and was constantly in his papers railing against it. I just want to quote one article that appeared in one of Douglass's papers. This is 18 months into the Mexican-American War. And he says, "We have seen for 18 months the work of mutilation, crime, and death go on, each advancing step sunk deeper in human gore. By every mail has come some new deed of violence. Cities have been attacked, and the cry of helpless women and children has risen amid the shrieks and agony of death and dishonor. The living have gone forth, and dead corpses encased in lead have returned. Thousands of widows and orphans have been sent up to the heavens. Their pitiful wail, and yet all is quiet as under the most perfect despotism. There is no united appeal which would make the rulers tremble, no thronging voices of petition, no indignant rebuke, no prayer, Lord, how long?" He was basically chastising the rest of the press and the leaders of the country, the silence over the continuing slaughter that was occurring in Mexico as a result of the Mexican-American War, which, of course, was a war that sharply increased the size of the United States by all the territories that were taken after the U.S. victory.
And, of course, Frederick Douglass owned his own paper. Tell the story of who Frederick Douglass was, his significance. I mean, the most famous abolitionist in the United States, born a slave. But from there, why he chose the media as his form of liberation.
Well, he was an amazing, anyone who's read any of the works of Frederick Douglass knows what an incredible writer he was. But he was an escaped slave and actually was hidden away when he arrived in New York by another journalist, David Ruggles, who was the editor of the Mirror of Liberty, and Ruggles not only was an editor of a newspaper, he was always constantly hiding fugitive slaves in New York from the slave catchers, and Douglass was one of the people who Ruggles saved, Douglass then went on to edit several newspapers and became a close friend of William Lloyd Garrison, obviously, who published The Liberator as well. But Douglass was incredible not only in his opposition to imperialist war, but in his championing the rights of women. He had many women writing for his newspaper. He was always advocating the equality of women. So he was far ahead of his time on many issues. One of the really great journalists of the 20th century, of the 19th century, but then again, except in the African-American community, he's rarely talked about as the critical figure that he was.
So what's really incredible about everything Juan is saying is the fact that there were African-Americans and people of color actually writing stuff and were brave enough to actually put word to print in a time of oppressive discrimination in our country. And it goes to the point that Juan made when he began the discussion about centralization versus decentralization. The reason these guys were able to put out papers because the U.S. postal system was a decentralized system. The delivery of mail was heavily subsidized, where it made it easy. Basically, the postal system was the delivery of newspapers, but it allowed, because it was decentralized, African Americans, people of color, and Native Americans, Latinos, first Latinos, Spanish language newspaper, 1808, to distribute newspapers, and that's why we argue to this very day that decentralization is really what's critical that will allow us to be able to tell our stories, whether it goes from radio, television, and now the internet. So I think that is the primary lesson that these guys were able to even exist at the time because of postal policy.
And that was a result, because I mentioned earlier the seminal debates. The first seminal debate in American history over the media was the debate over the creation of the post office in 1792 in Congress, where different leaders among the founders of the country had different viewpoints, because the post office Jefferson, Washington were in favor of the government delivering newspapers to the people for free. Madison and others were saying, no, let's do it at market rate, whatever it costs to deliver them. Because understand the importance of newspapers in America. Printers and editors were critical to the American Revolution. Without the editors and printers who got involved in spreading the word of opposition to England, it's conceivable that the revolution would not have developed as quickly as it did. So the printers then played a critical role, several of them, in the founding of the country, and then they pressed for a postal system that would deliver papers. Because remember, the United States was a country that had a territory that was settled. The people lived far apart in their farms all around the country. News and information for a new country was critical to keeping the country together. So that's why Washington and Jefferson favored free delivery of newspapers. And the postal system became the first internet, really. Wherever there was a settlement, there was a post office. And the government built a road, a postal road, to get to that post office and deliver the mail. But 90% of the mail was not letters. It was newspapers.
Didn't the post office at first refuse to mail abolitionist newspapers?
Well, yeah, but that came later as the battle over slavery occurred. But when the founders created the postal system, a requirement was that it had to deliver all mail, and also that eventually the compromise that they reached was the creation of a second-class postal system, where basically papers were delivered at subsidized cost, so that you had a situation where the United States quickly developed the most newspapers per capita of any country in the world. And, you know, I have like one example, the town of Jacksonville, Illinois, right? In 1830, Jacksonville, Illinois, which was the largest town in Illinois at that time, had 446 residents. But those 446 residents, virtually every one of them was receiving at least one periodical in the mail. 89 of them were receiving 2, and and those were only papers from out of town. That didn't include the papers that were being published within the town. So that basically Americans read newspapers constantly because the government was subsidizing the delivery of the newspapers, and they were doing it because our founders said that the widest possible dissemination of news and information is vital to the preservation of the republic. So there was a government policy that said the people need to have news, and it should be local news, and it should be subsidized news. Very different from the market advocates of today who say keep the government out, let us handle the internet, and we'll assure that the public gets the news and information it needs.
Statistic to that, by the end of the 1700s, within a 10-year period, the number of newspapers climbed from around 90 to 200, around 200, 230. By 1830, it was 1,400 newspapers. That shows you what postal policy did to really grow newspapers as a country, to allow for the creation of newspapers in cities throughout the country and local towns. So.
And that's why you had, for instance, before the Civil War, there were close to 100 Hispanic newspapers in the United States. Before the Civil War, the city of New Orleans alone had 25 Spanish-language newspapers, including a daily. That was a result of the government-subsidized postal policies that made it very easy, if you could print a paper, to get it delivered. So that there was a fostering of local press and local information. But that, of course, changed dramatically in the late 19th century with the development of the telegraph.
We're going to get to that after this break. And I want to talk about Ida B. Wells and Ruben Salazar and where we are today with the Internet and the battle over who controls the Internet. Our guests are Juan Gonzalez, usually here interviewing others on Democracy Now!, but today with Joe Torres, talking about their new epic work, News for All the People, the epic story of race and the American media. This is Democracy Now! If you'd like a copy of today's show, you can go to our website at democracynow.org. We'll be back with Juan and Joe in a minute.